Newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Happy to be with you, and we have some interesting stuff to talk about today regarding the Superintendent for Public Instruction race. Apparently, I don't know if you were following earlier this week, but the two primary candidates, Democrat and Republican, met in debate. And the most amazing thing that came out of the debate, and this is actually considering mainstream coverage as well as coverage from sources that were, shall we say, a little less invested than Main Street, in other words, more objective sources. It appeared they agreed on a lot of things. They really seemed to agree that, yes, the government monopoly on public education is the way to go. And it was a matter of degrees as opposed to, I have a very different vision. Now, that can play a couple of different ways, as you're going to hear. Of course, often proponents of government-run education will say anyone who talks about reform in the education arena really just hates education and wants to do away with government schools. But when it comes to issues like parental choice or funding following students as opposed to simply following the systems, maybe there needs to be some reform. So let's start with Betsy Russell's piece for the idahopress.com. School debate, rivals for Idaho State Superintendent clash over issues and role. Now, I'm not trying to be snarky when I say this, but I wondered at a couple of different places here if Betsy struggled simply because there was no really clear, she really couldn't use the words extremist or far right to describe, current, the current superintendent, or I'm sorry, for the Republican opponent, Debbie Critchfield. But Democratic candidate for state school superintendent Terry Gilbert decried his Republican opponent, former State Board of Education President Debbie Critchfield, as a policy wonk during a live debate this year, saying he's the only candidate with the heart of a teacher. I'm not a politician, he said, I'm an educator, during the Idaho debates Monday evening on Idaho Public Television. Now, when someone tells you, I'm not a politician, or I'm really honest, you can trust me, I'm just saying, the more they say it, the more you should be careful, because usually you can tell by looking at a person, judging their actions and what they've done. If they have to tell you about it, that might be a little bit of a red flag. Now, Critchfield said, look, I think it's important to note that the assignment as state superintendent is very different than that of a classroom teacher. We value and want the skills that an energized and passionate teacher brings to the classroom. And you want that same type of energy at the state level, but you need someone who's worked with policymakers, with legislators, who's familiar with working with the stakeholders in the state. And these are all things that I've been able to acquire, skills I can bring to the table right on day one. Now, Gilbert responded to this, with, but I'm the one who really cares. I'm the teacher. And that's not to say that teachers shouldn't be represented, but sometimes I wonder why we don't hear more focus on, look, what is the purpose for public education? Because when I hear calls for greater funding, sometimes it seems to come off as if the system needs, teachers deserve more, administrators deserve, we need more programs. And somewhere way back in the back is, oh yeah, and the kids need to be educated too. It just seems like that's a lesser priority. Or there are competing priorities for how to educate those kids, including some ways that a lot of parents are finding particularly distasteful. Now, the issue of vouchers and school choice was one of the places where there actually was a bit of a difference in the way that the candidates saw things, but it wasn't a huge difference. Asked if she'd support allowing parents to use public dollars, I'm going to translate that for you, taxpayer money. So we act like, oh, well, once we've taken it from the taxpayer, this is public money and can only be used in ways that whoever's in charge, says it can be used. But it's taken from the taxpayer. So let's not pretend that somehow this came from a magical place known as the state. Allowing parents to use public dollars for scholarships to private or religious education. Now, Critchfield's answer was yes and no. We don't want to defund public schools, she said. Okay, this is her nod to the current power system, and it should not come at the risk of rural schools. What I'd like to see is a thoughtful, balanced approach to how we address this. That's a pretty middle of the road answer, and probably what you would expect from someone who really doesn't want to anger the big constituencies, either the teachers unions or the people who are very heavily invested in public schools, which includes a lot of politicians who really seem to think that that's the only way that it can be done. Now, Gilbert, look at this. Here's the hard line. If you want to kill public schools, let's adopt a voucher program. Wow, it escalated quickly, right? We're going to kill them, huh? I call them voucher vultures. They circle around the public schools. They wait for them to die. They spread messages and rumors about the schools or what the schools are doing. Yeah, rumors, really? Do you know that they're indoctrinating your child? Sorry, Mr. Gilbert, but the evidence doesn't look good on your side. There are people indoctrinating our children. The latest pitch was they're teaching pornography. I don't think the pitch was that they're teaching pornography, but they're certainly trying to make it the case that it has a place in our schools, and anyone who burns books, which is apparently what people who protest inappropriate material, you're a book burner, maybe a step down from a Nazi in the eyes of those who want really sexually explicit material available to the kids. I don't quite understand it, but that's the clown world that we live in right now. So he says, this latest pitch that they're teaching pornography, well, after they've split the parents from the public schools, you mean shown them what the public schools are doing to their kids. Then they say, oh, we have this neat spiffy idea. We have this voucher program. I'm very much opposed to it. Now, competition is not a bad thing, but for some reason, the most diehard advocates of public school are, those who believe that it should be a monopoly and nothing should offer any kind of choice. And it's always, well, it'll come at the expense of those who can least afford it. But you'd be surprised at some of the things that are available. We'll talk more about those in a moment. Gilbert added, we have school choice now. We have public charter schools. We have home schools. We have public schools. We have magnet schools. We have lots of choices now. We don't have to, are you ready for this? Ruin our democracy in our country by gravitating to a voucher program. See, I want to sort out what exactly he means by ruin our democracy by gravitating to a voucher program. First of all, what is our democracy? Because the more I hear people use that phrase, the more I start to understand they're talking about our system of rule. In other words, the status quo. We don't want to ruin our status quo. We don't want to ruin our grip on power by gravitating to a voucher program, or in this case, just simply providing an alternative, providing competition. Now, Critchfield said, as I traveled the state over the last 18 months, I have heard from parents at every level of education, at every delivery, at every environment, and there are those who absolutely believe that as their parental decisions direct, that they would like to have money to go towards that. So I don't think we discount that. It isn't just a black and white to her. She says, how do we come at this in a way that balances the interests of everyone, respecting where we are with public schools as a constitutional mandate, and find solutions for all Idahoans? And I like Gilbert's response, even though it's kind of a cop-out here. He responded tersely, sounds good. It's not good. Well, if it limits or in any way reduces state power or state control of this particular institution, I'm sure that's what he's thinking. That's not a good thing. I mean, how could it possibly be good? Other topics that they covered during the debate included test scores, initiative in the special session, also spending the new money, and the teacher shortage. And one thing that came through loud and clear is that both of them support the system. They're very staunch supporters of the system itself. And, this is not to say that we should do away with it in a heartbeat. But why? Doesn't anybody ask where we have been conditioned to accept the idea that the only way to educate kids really is in a government-run school system? It wasn't always the case. Who says it has to be the case? Well, it's written in the Constitution. You do realize that there is such a thing as an amendment process. And we've seen other amendments come and go. And, I'm just saying, if it's something that could be improved upon, and perhaps separation of school and state, I know that'll get a few people's hearts beating. Maybe it's something that needs to be examined, but to simply support it for the sake of, well, it's the way things have been and the way that it's always been. There's a tremendous amount of power and money at stake here. This is one of the reasons why politicians and teachers unions, among others, special interests fight to maintain that monopoly in public education. Now, to contrast Betsy Russell's article, which again, I'm not really faulting Betsy. This wasn't that big of a difference between the candidates. So it wasn't like she had to demonize anybody, as she often will do in her pieces as a narrative controller. But let's turn to Caitlin Shepard writing a piece for the Center for American Education. You can find this on the idahofreedom.org website. Just look for the Center for American Education. This was, I thought, a very good recap in that it asked questions and answered questions and provided some perspective that mainstream sources really didn't. They were more like, well, who could show more love for the public school system? Whereas this is asking, how's the public school system doing? So the headline, candidates for superintendent of public instruction defend monopoly system, fail to boldly advocate for students. Well, there's a different take. Caitlin writes, Monday evening, Democrat Terry Gilbert and Republican Debbie Critchfield, candidates for Idaho Superintendent of Public Instruction, debated key policy issues, including academic performance, school choice, and education spending. Both candidates advocated for failed policies like spending more on public education monopoly, and ultimately failed to boldly stand for parents' rights to direct the education of their children. I know it doesn't fit the narrative, but that is in reality what happened. So let's take the issue, for instance, of academic performance. One of the first questions candidates were asked concerned students' declining results on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, otherwise known as the nation's report card. Critchfield acknowledged that only around 1/3 of students performed proficient or above in math and reading. However, she expressed the need for a celebration of sorts for the work we've been able to do in addressing post-pandemic learning loss. So although student test scores on the English language arts section of the Idaho Standards Achievement Test are back to pre-pandemic levels, there's still an awful lot of students who are scoring below proficient. That's a problem. Idaho's results on the 2022 NAEP show declining academic performance from the last administered test in 2019. So in math, the percentage of fourth grade students who were proficient or above declined from 43.02% to 36.33%. The percentage of eighth grade students declined from 37.34% to 32.43%. In reading, the percentage of fourth graders who scored proficient or above declined from 37.44% to 31.91%. And the percentage of eighth graders who scored similarly declined from 37.08% to 32.12%. I mean, these are pretty noticeable declines. And Caitlin points out here, Idaho students must be able to master basic reading, writing, and math skills so they're prepared to achieve future personal, professional, and academic success. Now, on the matter of school choice, here's how Caitlin reported it. She said, although school choice programs enjoy robust support from parents, neither candidate staunchly supported school choice programs that would serve the unique needs of students and families. Gilbert expressed clear opposition to the idea of school vouchers. He said, if you want to kill public schools, let's adopt a voucher program. We don't have to ruin our democracy in our country by gravitating to a voucher system. Now, Gilbert also expressed the opinion that sufficient options exist for families who can choose from charter schools, homeschools, public schools, and magnet schools in the current system. So why would school choice kill public schools? This is what Caitlin Shepard is asking. Public officials know that if given the choice, many families would find or could find better alternative education sources outside of the public school monopoly. Every kid deserves the opportunity to receive the best education possible, but candidates like Gilbert prefer to funnel students into that one-size-fits-all education system that stifles opportunity as well as potential. Contrary to Gilbert's pronouncements, the competitive benefits of school choice programs could actually improve existing public schools. After all, as research has shown, school choice is the rising tide that lifts all boats. Now, Critchfield took a little ambivalent stance on the question of school choice programs, stipulating that any school choice program in which public funding is used at private institutions couldn't come at the expense of public schools or rural students who have limited choices. However, education funding exists to serve students, not to prop up a government monopoly. And again, this is an angle you will never hear from the press, not because, well, it's invalid or it's wrong, but simply because it doesn't fit the narrative. The state needs to be in control. Otherwise, they consider it out of control. Caitlin writes, additionally, both candidates ignored the reality that these rural students now have many educational options outside of brick and mortar public schools. Now, these options include micro schools or pods, homeschooling, homesteading, online education, and more. Yet many of these families can't afford alternative education. So why should such a burden exist for rural students or any students who deserve access to the best education possible. Then there was a question on the special session funding. Candidates were asked how the $330 million allocated to the K-12 education by Governor Brad Little and the legislature this September should be spent. Now, Gilbert said half that money should be funneled into failed literacy programs, while the other half should be spent to increase salaries for teachers and support professionals. Critchfield said the money should be spent on career technical education, vocational programs, and public-private partnerships and apprenticeships. Both candidates want to use the funds to prop up the existing government monopoly. Caitlin says Idaho's K-12 education funding should follow students, not systems. After all, this money doesn't belong to schools. It's meant for the purpose of educating children. And just like in other areas of life, families ought to be able to choose the educational option that works best for them and that best aligns with their family's needs and values. And listen to what she points out here. We don't force families to use their food stamps at Albertsons instead of Winco. Indeed, families are demanding choices in education. Recent polling indicates 75% of Idaho parents support education savings accounts. 70% support school vouchers. Now, universal school choice that's available to every Idaho student, regardless of income, would ensure that all students in Idaho can access the educational environment that works best for them. Offering students the best possible education instead of defending a government monopoly should be the top priority of the Superintendent of Public Education, or Public Instruction, rather. Unfortunately, neither of Idaho's current candidates are willing to boldly stand for the needs of the students. And I'm just asking you to consider, why is that? Why do you think they don't want to make that stand? I mean, look, on the one hand, there's the practical consideration. If they were to make such a stand, of course, it would invite criticism. And criticism's, going to be coming at them. It'll probably look a little bit like this. Here we have, let's take somebody who's used to a little criticism. Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson says, parents should have the economic freedom to send their students where they want. And of course, the mainstream media response would be, so you're saying you want to destroy all public schools. See, there's that just binary way of looking at things. They just can't fathom the idea, the people who believe that this has to be a government monopoly. It has to be administered by the state. And I'm sorry, I have to just point out, this is, again, the mantra of statism. Something that's not under the direct control of the state is deemed to be, by definition, out of control. But unless we can start thinking outside of that box, and again, I'm going to use the phrase separation of school and state, I don't think you're going to see anything much different. There are too many special interests that are very, very deeply invested in maintaining that control, maintaining that monopoly. And as you will see, with some of the things that are being introduced into our schools in the name of, inclusion and diversity and equity, there's some pretty twisted ideas that they're trying to get into these kids' minds. Not to mention the changes in the vaccination schedule that may prompt a number of parents to be looking for alternatives to public school where their kids have to take the COVID vaccine. I don't know if Idaho's legislature is going to step up and say that that cannot be, forced on the students at the state level. But you got to admit, that's a pretty bold move on the part of the CDC to try to require this. And unfortunately, for a lot of parents who are skeptical, and rightly so, having seen, the emerging numbers of vaccine injuries, particularly in young people who are already at very, very low risk from COVID. Yeah, this might be what drives a lot of people to looking for alternatives. Now, I want to piggyback on what Caitlin Shepard was saying with a couple of excerpts from a column from Wayne Hoffman. This is from the Idaho Freedom Foundation, idahofreedom.org. And Wayne was talking about how the latest test results offer even more proof that government shouldn't be in the education business. Now, you may say, well, that sounds like he wants to destroy public education. To me, it sounds like someone who's looking for a better way to approach this, where bad results don't keep getting rewarded as if they were actually producing what they promised. So here's what Wayne had to say. He said, it may be true that Idaho's test scores are marginally better than peers in other states, our peers aren't doing well. In fact, roughly a mere third of Idaho 4th and 8th graders are proficient in reading and math, according to NAEP. The national average is between 25 and 32%, depending on the subject. Imagine running a business of any kind in which fewer than half of your customers didn't get what they came for. Think about that. Not over just the course of one day of lousy service and disappointing results, but for years of it. Most businesses would close under such conditions. So why does this go on? Well, it's because politicians get a lot of money and support from a cabal of education special interests whose sole priority is to keep the existing system, the failing system, in place. Public education is a multi-billion-dollar business. Labor unions, school administrators, transportation companies, and businesses selling everything from software to textbooks to cafeteria food all benefit from keeping that status quo going. Now, he says, truly, only government can stay in the business of education because they can force people to pay for the service through taxation, regardless of whether parents and students are actually happy with the product they're receiving. Opening up the education market to allow for more competition and allowing parents to have more say in where their education is spent is the most expedient way to improve educational outcomes across the board. Wayne says parents deserve to have as many options as possible when it comes to the education of their children. Idaho lawmakers and governors historically have been reluctant to open opportunities for more education options, but not because doing so would actually harm the students. It's because it would harm the adults, the politicians, and educrats who need the system to remain as it is for their own sakes. Now, again, that may seem like some harsh truth, but it's truth nonetheless. Which brings us to, again, here we are with this superintendent race in which you really have candidates that are pretty much in agreement. They only disagree on the degree to which the taxpayers should continue to prop up a system that, by objective measurements, is failing on many counts. Now, that's not denigrating the people who work within that system. I've mentioned before, my own wife is a public school teacher. She takes it seriously. She does a marvelous job. But the system itself, if that one-size-fits-all approach is so good, it seems like we would be seeing better results for our students. And this points to a larger problem, too, with a lot of the candidates that you'll be considering here in a couple of weeks when it's time to vote in the midterms. And that is, do they really stand for the proper role of government? In other words, limited government, whose job is to protect and guarantee your God-given rights. In other words, to limit government power over you. Or are they people who are just going to quibble over the degree to which they should be fleecing you or controlling you? Because more often than not, that's what it comes down to. Few people seem to question the premise of, wait, is that power they should be exercising in the first place? They just want to argue over, well, should we have this much or should we have this much? That's a losing proposition. Which brings me to a couple final thoughts here. You really do have a choice. And when you go to vote, I'm not going to pretend that voting is the final, this is the panacea that will save everything. But I think you're going to see a lot of people headed to the polls this year because they recognize that there are some things that are drastically wrong. And if the indications that we saw earlier in the primaries and which some of the old guard is being turned out because of their coziness with statism, big government, oppressive government, there might be time for some house cleaning. So probably not going to see so much of a change like in the superintendent's race, but in other races, you're definitely seeing it. And you're also seeing the press, that legacy media, stepping up and playing the role of telling us, steering us in the direction of this person is scary, far right, extremist, don't be swayed. But I'm going to ask you to consider something just a little bit different. I'm going to ask you to consider, do the people who actually have suffered for their beliefs, do they have more credibility than those who don't? And I'm including the bureaucrats, who just want to avoid accountability and just keep the gravy train going as long as they possibly can. The candidates who are being demonized, and by the way, it runs the whole gamut. Ammon Bundy's probably the most demonized candidate, but then again, he's probably the most visible and probably has the most baggage of any candidate. But right down to, your local library boards, people are just wrapped around the axles of this person does not have the ideological purity. And they go on this scorched earth cancel campaign. We've got to get the cancel mob ginned up. The people who are on the receiving end of that could avoid the pain. They could avoid the humiliation simply by sitting down, shutting up, and not being involved. But if they don't, and if they persist in their efforts to be a candidate, to offer a difference, or at least some kind of a reasonable alternative to just maintaining the status quo, if not giving it the status quo to us even harder, I would encourage you to listen to them. Oftentimes, the people who are suffering the most are the people who are doing the they're doing the most selfless thing. And it's seldom people who are just clamoring for attention or people who are clamoring for power, because those kind of people have more of a narcissistic kind of personality that really can't handle criticism. It really can't handle anything other than adoration and affirmation, which of course, you get by towing the status line. So think about those people who are willing to suffer for their beliefs. And I'm not saying you need to find the saddest sack candidate that you can and vote for them, but just understand they are doing something that is far more courageous than what they're being given credit for. They actually have skin in the game. The fact that they're willing to suffer for their beliefs and still keep speaking the truth should tell you a little bit about where their priorities are. That's not the mark of somebody who's this is all about me. It's all about me getting power and recognition. That's someone who's trying to do the right thing. And of course, the thing that the establishment fears most about those kind of individuals is that their example, their courage is going to spark similar courage in others. It's contagious. I mean, you think about it in your own life. I guarantee there have been times where you and I have had people in our lives who did the right thing, and it strengthened us in a moment of weakness or in a moment where we were wavering and we saw somebody do the right thing and realized, I can do that too. And likewise, it's a very good possibility. You are the kind of person who at some point has done the right thing, and someone watching from afar drew strength from you for doing that as well. I guess the bottom line is simply this. We cannot wait until everybody approves of something before we safely move forward. Well, then, we have consensus, and now everybody can go forward and know that nobody is going to be upset. The people who need to speak what needs to be spoken, in other words, the people who need to tell the truth, the people who need to suggest and put forth the ideas that most need to be considered, often are going to be considered heretics. That is the nature of how truth is, unfortunately. And the masses will despise them, and they will, take joy and, well, thank goodness, we didn't vote that person into office. Just understand, the people who are doing it, I think, for the right reasons, and deserve a little bit closer look than the people who, for some reason, never seem to be criticized, or better still, are supported by the establishment itself. In fact, that should be kind of a warning sign right there. If someone is supported by the establishment, you can be assured they pose no threat to the current situation. They pose absolutely no threat to the status quo. The people that are being labeled and, hooted down and called names the loudest, it's their principles. It's not that they're, going out there trying to burn everything down. It's that they represent a difference in principles. And by them being in the public spotlight or even offering that alternative, it brings shame to the people who are part of the system and abusing that power or just using it to maintain, their own little personal fiefdoms. It makes them look bad. The contrast and comparison doesn't work in their favor. So that's a very roundabout way of saying, I'm not telling you who to vote for, but I am suggesting if you're going to take a closer look at candidates, look at the ones who maybe are on the receiving end of the vitriol and ask yourself, is this really deserved? And if you have a question as to whether or not it's really deserved, you might even consider doing the really intellectually honest thing and go to them yourself. Go to the source wherever possible. Then you're not having to strain it through somebody's filter of, well, this is what makes them a good candidate or doesn't. Go to them, make up your own mind, but above all, question everything. So it's going to be interesting. We'll have a lot to talk about here in a couple of weeks because the midterms will have come and gone. Hopefully we'll have some speedy election results. I really can't bear the thought of, let's draw this out for a protracted 2 or 3 week or month-long, tabulation. But it'll be very interesting to see if there is some change in the wind. I certainly hope there is. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how